I'm Lucy Betts, and in this presentation I will be discussing some of the research that I've done alongside my colleague Peter McCauley. In particular, I'll be talking about our work exploring comparative optimism and cyberbullying, and this work involves looking at the role of experience and technology use for how this impacts individuals' comparative optimistic beliefs around the likelihood with which they and others will experience cyberbullying. So, to give you some background to this research, comparative optimism is the tendency to believe that compared to others, we are less likely to experience risk and that we're also less vulnerable than other people. So it's the belief that compared to others, negative things are less likely to happen to us and positive things are also more likely to happen to us, with negative things being something that occurs to other people and positive things not as likely to occur to others as it does to us. And there's been lots of research that has looked at comparative optimism within a broad range of topic areas, including things like driving ability, with individuals believing that they're better drivers than others, and also in regards to vulnerability around social media use. So for example, some research from 2015 reported that individuals tend to have overly optimistic beliefs around their own experience of positive events when using Facebook. So individuals tend to believe they're more likely to experience positive things compared to other Facebook users. And to complement this line of research, there is also evidence that perceptions of vulnerability decrease with age, so that as we get older, we have a tendency to believe we're less at risk, with those who are perceived to be most at risk younger than us. And this really relates to the belief that with age comes wisdom. So we think those younger than us are more likely to experience risk. And our own previous research has explored comparative optimistic beliefs relating to cyberbullying. And in this study, participants were asked how likely they thought it was that they themselves would experience cyberbullying, and also how likely it was they thought 5 comparator groups would experience cyberbullying. And the comparator groups were friends, people younger than the participants, people the same age, people older, and also strangers. So what we were doing here was really exploring that with age comes wisdom idea, and also we attempted to vary some of the social distance between comparator groups. So individuals who are friends are more socially close to the participants. And what we found was that across 3 samples of individuals who were late adolescents, emerging adults and adults, we found there was a consistent tendency for individuals to display an optimistic bias. So in other words, our participants, irrespective of which sample they were in, thought that they were less likely to experience cyberbullying than the various comparator groups. Individuals who were seen to be at greatest risk were those who were younger, which again provides some of those evidence for the theoretical accounts as to why that was the case. And there was also variation in terms of how participants rated friends versus strangers, with strangers being seen as being at much greater risk than both the self and also friends, but friends being seen to be at a similar level of risk in terms of experiencing cyberbullying as the individual themselves. And in our current study, what we wanted to do was to try and explore this finding further. The previous research that I've just talked about, we didn't explore involvement in cyberbullying. So in the current study, we were interested to see whether previous experiences of cyberbullying, either as a target, a perpetrator, or a witness, influenced this optimistic tendency around likely experiences of cyberbullying in the future. And we also increased the range of comparator groups to include some who were more socially distant than those that we'd included in the previous study, and I'll talk about that in a minute. The second aim was to explore how underlying motives of technology use may impact on comparative optimism. So we were particularly interested in terms of whether an individual's motivation for using technology and also their level of technology use influenced their perceptions of relative risk of experiencing cyberbullying. In terms of the sample, we collected data from 444 university students with a mean age of 20, and our participants completed all measures online, and they were asked to complete measures that assessed problematic internet use and fear of missing out, and this was to assess their level of engagement with technology and also their motives for using technology. And we also asked them about their previous experiences of cyberbullying, either as a target, perpetrator, or witness, to see if that involvement in cyberbullying previously impacted their ratings that they made. In terms of assessing comparative optimism, we used a similar method to our previous research, where participants were asked to report the likelihood with which they thought themselves and up to 8 comparator groups would experience cyberbullying. They made these ratings individually on a 7-point scale for each of the comparator groups and for themselves. And we extended the number of comparator groups in this study compared with our previous research to include more individuals who were socially close to the participants, so family, and also to expand those who were more socially distant. So the comparator groups we used were friends, family members, enemies, people you don't like, people at your university, people older than you, people younger than you, and also strangers. And we used the participants' ratings to create a comparative optimism differential score by taking the average for the 8 comparator groups and then subtracting that from the likelihood of they themselves experiencing cyberbullying. Positive scores indicated greater optimism that the self would not experience cyberbullying relative to others, whereas negative scores indicated that the self would be more likely to experience cyberbullying relative to others, suggesting a more pessimistic stance, whereas scores close to 0 would suggest neither an optimistic nor a pessimistic stance. This slide shows the model that we tested. and we used process model 81 to test this hypothesized model as shown on the slide. So we predicted that fear of missing out would predict problematic internet use, with problematic internet use being a serial mediator in this relationship, and then previous involvement in cyberbullying, either as a target, perpetrator or witness, being parallel mediators in the relationship between fear of missing out and comparative optimism. On this slide, I've included the model to help with interpretation, and what we found was a number of significant indirect effects, which means that mediation was evident in the model. Highlighted in bold are those indirect effects that were significant. So problematic internet use mediated the relationship between fear of missing out and comparative optimism, such that having high levels of fear of missing out predicted higher levels of problematic internet use, which then in turn predicted comparative optimism. Because of how comparative optimism was scored, this meant that experiencing higher levels of problematic internet use was predictive of a belief that the self was more likely to experience cyberbullying. There was also a significant indirect effect of experiencing cyberbullying as a target and problematic internet use. This result suggests that having higher levels of fear of missing out predicted higher levels of problematic internet use, and the higher levels of problematic internet use in turn predicted experiencing cyberbullying as a target. Finally, experiencing elevated levels of cyberbullying as a target predicted lower levels of comparative optimism, such that individuals who had experienced cyberbullying as a target were more likely to think that they themselves would experience cyberbullying in the future. Similarly, there was an indirect effect of witnessing cyberbullying in the relationship between fear of missing out and comparative optimism. Again, the results suggest that having higher levels of fear of missing out predicted higher levels of problematic internet use, and higher levels of problematic internet use predicted witnessing cyberbullying. Finally, witnessing high levels of cyberbullying predicted comparative optimism, such that individuals who experienced witnessing cyberbullying were less likely to think that they themselves would experience cyberbullying in the future. And we also looked to see if we could replicate our previous findings in terms of comparative optimistic beliefs across the various comparator groups. And what we found, as in our previous research, was that the self was rated significantly lower than most of the comparator groups, so lower than enemies, people the participants didn't like, those at the same university, younger people, older people, and also strangers. Again, we found that friends, because they were more socially close to the individual, were rated as being less likely to experience cyberbullying, so in a way similar to the participants, and family, which was a new comparator group, was also rated in a similar way. And again, as before, we found that younger people were rated to be those most likely to experience cyberbullying, suggesting that with age comes wisdom does seem to impact on ratings of cyberbullying. So to conclude, Experiencing and witnessing cyberbullying impacts on beliefs about the future likelihood of cyberbullying. Motives and experiences of technology use also influence optimistic beliefs, and this research has potential implications for anti-cyberbullying interventions.